Welcome to another episode of Ape Answers. In today's episode, number 5, we're going to talk a little bit about oscilloscope bandwidth. A lot of times people have questions when they want to buy a new oscilloscope, what they need to look for, what they need to consider. And bandwidth is one of the more critical or important considerations. It's really going to determine the types of things that you're going to be able to measure. Recently I did a video where I was testing an HT, a handheld ham radio. And I was doing a test in the 70 centimeter or 440 megahertz band. And my oscilloscope only had a bandwidth of 350 megahertz. I mistakenly thought it was 500. And so my results were not correct. They were inaccurate. So I felt that it would be a good time to kind of talk a little bit about bandwidth and what it means. So today's question comes to us from Andy, Alpha Alpha Zero, Alpha Mike. And he said, like in Ape Answers. Well, thank you, Andy. I appreciate it. Good work. How long until we get into VNAs and oscilloscopes? And no, it's not just because I bought a new oscilloscope. Okay, fine. It's just because I bought an oscilloscope. So I said maybe we can bump this one to the list. So today, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about bandwidth. So a lot of times when we're looking at oscilloscopes, we come across these older models from the 70s and 80s. This one is a cathode ray tube oscilloscope. Most of the time, folks today are looking for digital storage oscilloscopes, but these older scopes work just fine if you get one that's in good working condition and has the bandwidth required for the types of measurements that you want to make. One of the things to consider is these older oscilloscopes are very large. They take up a lot of real estate on your desk, and they're very, very heavy. The other one is they don't come with any warranty, and repairs can be difficult. Unless you're really handy with electronics, and if you could repair something like this, frankly, you probably already have an oscilloscope. These things can be picked up relatively inexpensive at Hamfests or on eBay. But again, I kind of would caution a beginner to steer away or stay away from something like this. Now, I'm sure down in the comments there's going to be plenty of people who said that was their first oscilloscope and it works out great for them. The other thing is that we can get lured into buying some of these smaller multimeter type oscilloscopes because they are moderately priced. But a lot of times they have low bandwidth, poor resolution on the screen, crowding on the screen, making them difficult to read or interpret, and the user interfaces aren't the best. The O1 on the right has a little bit of a better user interface, but if you take a look at the Finersi on the left-hand side, it's really just a 4-button chevron, and that makes it extremely difficult to navigate. So that leaves us with these desktop oscilloscopes that are called digital storage oscilloscopes. This one's a mixed signal oscilloscope. But they have a nice screen on them, bright resolution, easy to read. Typically screens are around 7 inches from corner to corner, making them very easy to read. You can have multiple inputs, and then you can see a user interface that is complex at first and maybe a little bit off-putting, but once you get used to it, it's very easy to navigate. So let's start off with what is oscilloscope bandwidth, and it refers to the maximum frequency at which the oscilloscope can measure a signal with reasonable accuracy. To accurately capture and display the true shape of a signal, the oscilloscope bandwidth must be greater than the highest frequency component of the signal. And what that means is that when you're looking at things like digital signals, like maybe ramps, or if you're looking at things like square waves or pulses, those signals are actually made up of multiple frequencies. And a lot of times those frequencies are harmonics of a fundamental frequency that extend relatively high in the frequency bandwidth. And as a result, they become more difficult to measure accurately. In amateur radio, we use audio signals. They're RF signals with audio modulation on top of them. And the bandwidth requirements for amateur radio uses are typically lower. So what we have is, if the bandwidth is too low, that's the bandwidth of the oscilloscope, high frequency components will be attenuated, leading to an inaccurate representation. So the higher in frequency you go in comparison to your oscilloscope bandwidth, the more attenuation you get on your signal, making your waveforms not accurate. They won't accurately represent the signal being measured. So you might be asking how bandwidth affects signal measurement. For high frequency signals, an oscilloscope with insufficient bandwidth will miss some details, resulting in a loss of signal fidelity. And I think we just talked a little bit about that. The oscilloscope's ability to accurately measure the rise time, that's the time it takes for a signal to change from a low to a high state of a fast signal, is directly related to its bandwidth. A lower bandwidth will lead to a longer measured rise time, which will be inaccurate. So let's talk a little bit about bandwidth specification. Manufacturers often specify bandwidth as the frequency at which the signal amplitude is attenuated by 3 dB. And what we know as amateur radio operators, 3 dB is either doubling or halving of the power level or intensity. This is known as the -3 dB point, where the signal's power is reduced to half of its original value. Another thing that you want to consider is the probes that you use on your oscilloscope. The bandwidth of the probes used in the oscilloscope also affects the overall measurement bandwidth. Ensure that both the oscilloscope and probes have suitable bandwidth for your measurements. So for example, you may have an oscilloscope that has a 250 megahertz bandwidth, but if your probe is a secondhand probe and it only has 100 megahertz of bandwidth, it's going to impact your ability to do accurate measurement. Another consideration is sampling rate. The oscilloscope sampling rate should be as high enough to support the bandwidth. Now, there's something called the Nyquist theorem, which applies a little bit in this case, but not completely. But according to this theorem, the sampling rate should be at least twice the maximum frequency of the signal. So this video is not on sampling rate, but it's important to talk about it a little bit. And it's the number of samples an oscilloscope takes per second. It's measured in samples per second, a big S over a little s. For digital oscilloscopes, the higher sampling rate allows for better resolution in capturing the waveform, especially for higher frequency signals. So if you're working on electronic components and things like that, you definitely want a higher sampling rate. And this is according to the Nyquist theorem. To accurately capture a signal, the sample rate must be at least twice the highest frequency component of the signal. In practice, to ensure accurate waveform reconstruction and avoid aliasing, where higher frequency components are misrepresented as lower frequencies, the sample rate is typically set much higher than a Nyquist rate. So a common guideline is to use a sample rate that is 5 to 10 times the oscilloscope bandwidth. So even if an oscilloscope has a high enough sample rate, its bandwidth might limit the frequency components it can accurately measure. An oscilloscope with a bandwidth of 100 megahertz can accurately measure signals up to 100 megahertz, but its sample rate still must be high enough to capture those signals properly. Conversely, if an oscilloscope has a high bandwidth but a low sample rate, it won't be able to accurately capture high-frequency signals. For an example, an oscilloscope with 1 gigahertz of bandwidth but only 1 gigasample per second, it would struggle to measure signals near its bandwidth limit. So there's some common bandwidth recommendations, and the 5x rule, it's a conservative guideline to ensure that not only the fundamental frequency but also those higher order harmonics that we talked about are captured accurately. It helps in maintaining the signal integrity and capturing sharp transition and detailed waveform characteristics. There's also something, a 2.5 times to 3 times rule, and this is more typical on a practical guideline for many applications. When you're using an oscilloscope with a sample rate of 2.5, 2.5, to 3 times the highest frequency component of your signal is sufficient to accurately capture the signal without significant distortion. So finally, the real point of this conversation, the bandwidth considerations for HF. So when we talk about high frequency or HF radio signals, the span of frequency ranges from around 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz. I'm not counting the 160 meter band. If you want to complain about that in the comments, feel free. So when selecting an oscilloscope for analyzing HF radio signals, you need to consider several factors to ensure accurate signal capture and analysis. To really analyze HF radio signals effectively, the oscilloscope bandwidth should be sufficient to capture the higher frequency components of the signals you're interested in. A general guideline is to choose an oscilloscope with a bandwidth at least 1.5 to 2 times the highest frequency that you want to analyze. This ensures that you can capture not only the fundamental frequencies, but also the relative harmonics and other signal components that might be present. So let's talk about what a minimum recommendation for HF analyzation would be. And this is signals 3 to 30 megahertz. What I would take a look at is a minimum bandwidth of 30 megahertz. I would recommend a bandwidth of 45 to 60 megahertz, but suggest a higher bandwidth for additional headroom at around 100 megahertz. Selecting an oscilloscope with these 3 bandwidth ranges will ensure that you can accurately capture and analyze your HF radio signals, and this will take into account for both fundamental frequencies and any higher order harmonics or transient details. Anyhow, I hope this helps. And remember, if you ask questions, you may be featured in a future episode of Ape Answers. Thanks for watching, everybody. Greatly appreciated.